You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your inspired host, Abraham.
And I'm your compassionate host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that people do, and sometimes we celebrate the amazing people for the things that they have done. If you like what you hear today and would like to support us in some way, you can subscribe, leave a rating and review, pick up some merch, join us on Patreon, all that stuff. You can interview people about why they do what they do and then write a book about it called Why We Do What We Do, and then give us 50% of the profits from that. And that would be wonderful support as well.
Yes.
But I'll talk more about the ways you can support us at the end of this discussion.
Absolutely. So today we are talking about a gentleman named David Henry Breaux. This is going to be an interesting tale, I think.
Yeah, not to be confused with David Henry Thoreau, even though they sound so similar.
Yeah, the guy that we're talking about today did not write Infinite Jest.
But if you're joining us on the day that this publishes, which is September 13th, then we'd like to wish you a wonderful and happy National Peanut Day. One of the best of all the nuts.
Big fan of that nut. It's also Defy Superstition Day, which really aligns with this podcast, I think.
Indeed. I am given to understand that peanut is not actually a nut for all of you pedants out there who want to email me about that.
Yeah, it's a legume, is it not? A legume.
I believe it's a legume. It is also International Chocolate Day, which makes sense because chocolate and peanut butter just go together.
Yeah, also aligns with this podcast really well.
Yes.
It's National Bald is Beautiful Day, which is not part of this podcast, but we do support the bald heads in the world.
Yeah, we're very hairy, but we are fans of Peter Sagal from Wait, Don't Tell Me.
So. Yeah, we'll be allies.
Okay. It is National Programmers Day for all of you out there who are programming computer things. Good, we celebrate you. We salute you.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's National Hug Your Boss Day, which is definitely put together by like some creepy white boss, like white old man.
Yeah.
It was like, come on, why don't you want to give me a hug? But, you know.
That is exactly how that happened. Anyway, it is National Quiet Day, which we are going to entirely ignore for the purpose of today's episode.
Yeah, this format does not lend itself to quiet.
It does not.
Dead airspace is not good for a podcast. It's National Kids Take Over the Kitchen Day, which, you know, sounds dangerous.
Yeah, put the plastic lining down.
Uh-huh.
It is National Celiac Disease Awareness Day for all of you on Atkins.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just kidding. Just to people generally who are gluten intolerant.
Yeah. It's also Positive Thinking Day, which I like.
Yeah, absolutely. It is similar to that. It is Rolled Doll Day. So go read James the Giant Peach or something.
Or, you know, the BFG, which, you know, I always joke that stands for Big Friggin' Guy.
That's pretty good. I like that.
It's also Direct Support Professional Recognition Day, or week. I'm sorry, it should be week. Should be the entire year because DSPs do a crazy amount of work and do not get enough pay or support for it.
Yeah, super helpful. We also salute you.
Mm-hmm.
It is Line Dance Week, so if that's your thing, you have a whole week to talk about it, I guess, and do it or something.
Yeah, I guess if that's a thing that you do. I never could line dance because I can't dance. It's National Environmental Services Week. Big fan of that.
Yes, and then also National Suicide Prevention Week. Big fan of that.
Uh-huh. It's Chef Appreciation Week. So, you know, compliments to the chef. Yes, chef.
And finally, it is Housekeepers Week. We definitely want to acknowledge those housekeepers.
It's a busy week, so hopefully you have a place where you can get cheap gifts because you have to buy a lot of gifts for people this week, it sounds like.
There's a lot going on. Yeah, the 13th is quite full of them. And of course, there's the week holidays or recognition things as well. But anyway, we're not here to talk about all of those holidays. We're here to talk about one person who had an interesting mission in life. And the reason that I wanted to talk about him is because I found his story just very inspiring. I was very moved by this. The things that he has done. And I felt like it was worth understanding a bit more about this person, about his life, about his sort of philosophy, if you will, and sharing that with people because he just had such an interesting story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's probably worth diving into just kind of understand this man.
Yeah. This is a story about love. It's a story about compassion. It's a story about inspiration. We're talking, as we said, about David Henry Breaux. He was born in Duarte, California. This is for those of you not up on your California geography, this is sort of northeast LA. You're getting up into the mountains at the base of the San Gabriel Mountains. David was the youngest of 3 children to a Jamaican immigrant mother and French Creole father.
David, his older brother and his sister Maria, grew up poor in their California suburb and had a rough childhood.
Specifically because their mother was schizophrenic, was very unpredictable, as you might imagine. And even in Maria recalled a time when, as a teenager, their mother apparently entered Maria's room in the middle of the night, stood over her with a knife, and spoke of needing to kill Maria. Fortunately, their father happened to catch her. He was able to intervene. He got her out of the room before anything happened. And, Maria recounts, like, she doesn't think her mom really intended her harm, but obviously a scary situation when someone who needs some extra support.
Absolutely. But their father was also no hero. He routinely whipped and beat his children and his wife as a form of, quote, medical treatment, as he called it, which sounds really difficult to deal with.
Yeah. Now, nevertheless, with all of this going on, they've got some unpredictability, some sort of volatile behavior from their mother. They've got some volatile behavior and violence from their father. The siblings were very close. They really supported one another. In particular, David and Maria were very close to one another and really looked out for each other.
So kind of going forward on that, David essentially had a very little relationship with his father beyond the corporal punishment part. David would recall, quote, "I am pressed to remember a conversation between my father and I lasting longer than a minute during those years," end quote, which is a shame. And it's unfortunate that this is kind of the relationship that he has. And this is unfortunately very common as well.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, you hear some of this and you see what could be the shaping of someone who could have turned out to be a very violent, very unpleasant person to be around when they sort of grew up around that sort of thing. But David proved to be pretty resilient. After graduating high school, both David and Maria attended Stanford University, where David graduated with a degree in urban studies. It's apparently a thing. And while at college, their mother passed away. Sorry, I don't mean to belittle that degree. I have never heard it before this setting. So
yeah, I hadn't either. So it's super, super fascinating. I'll have to look more into it.
Yeah.
Now, after graduating college, David's father was alone, getting older, and in poor health. He asked David to return home to help take care of him, and David agreed, later writing, quote, "No longer seeing him as a father, as a tyrant, as a dictator, as an abuser, no longer seeing him as anything other than a human being. I always suggest to those who come to me asking about forgiveness to do it before someone passes. Forgiveness is being at peace with the past, and I know I could never do what I do today as a figurehead for compassion if I were not for forgiving my father," end quote. So I actually think this is really important. This idea of, while you have time to do this, being able to forgive and forget and let go of things and it's not everybody can do it. Not everybody is willing to do that, and no judgment on that. But I personally subscribe to this idea of, like, I've got to be able to let go. I can forgive, not forget, but I can forgive a lot of things that have happened in my life.
Absolutely.
I completely get what he's saying.
Yeah, and this is starting to get into what I found so inspirational about this story is thinking about, David was not in no way obligated to take this on. He didn't really have a relationship with his father. He had a very poor history with his father, and nevertheless, he decided to make that choice for himself, for his family, to just think about this in terms of what's the most compassionate way for me to approach this. And there's just so many times in life that I think that solution seems very elusive, where it's more important sometimes for us to feel like we're right than for us to be kind, where it's more important for us to be vengeful than it is for us to be forgiving. And so I love this part of the story.
Yeah.
I mean, all of the story.
Yeah. I think it's important too to note that, like, that is not for everybody. So, like, I think, as I've gotten older and I've realized, like, that's for me a personal thing. If you've got a personal thing going on, whatever it may be, family related, person related, like, it is not an obligation. So, like, we're not saying that, like, this person is better than anybody else or that you are a bad person for not forgiving. It's simply just a perspective to take more than anything.
You're absolutely right. And for myself, what I hear in this is, like, that is kind of like how I would like to be,
Yes.
Not everyone's going to feel that way, but that's sort of how it landed with me, at least. So
absolutely. Me too. Now,
eventually, Maria and David made their way to the San Francisco Bay Area. This is sort of northern-ish California, starting to get up toward Northern California. In February 2008, a then 34-year-old David went through a particularly difficult breakup that left him depressed. And he happened to, during this time, attend a TED Talk by Karen Armstrong. And the TED Talk was called My Wish, the Charter for Compassion. In this TED Talk, it really landed with him. It really resonated with, this is now what I want my life to be about. And one of the quotes that was in this TED Talk I thought I'd pull out is where she says, quote, "Compassion goes beyond communities. It's recognizing others' humanity. The world is drawn together and yet farther apart because of compassion," end quote. I'm not sure if that was exactly the one that he pulled from, but that was I thought a relevant quote in there. And so, yeah, this whole talk of hers was really oriented around this idea of compassion.
Yeah. So, moved and inspired by the talk, David found his purpose, compassion. He wanted to work on his compassion work full-time, is what he said. He wanted to work on his, quote, compassion work full-time, learn about compassion, and help promote compassionate behavior. And he went to Lake Merritt in Oakland to ask people what they thought compassion is.
He also moved to Davis in 2009 to live with a friend, and with a notebook that would later become many notebooks, he decided to stand at the corner of 3rd and C Street. You don't really need to know anything about it besides that that's a particular location in the story,
right?
And would ask passersby to describe what compassion meant to them. So he'd simply ask them, like, what is compassion? What do you think it is? What does it mean to you? And he would write down what they said in his notebook that, again, became many notebooks.
Right, which is a really fascinating thing. And also, I think important to kind of think about. This is a stranger standing on the street asking you questions and recording your responses. But despite the fact that he stood at an imposing 6'2", he was able to amass more than 11,000 responses from total strangers, giving their thoughts on what compassion meant, which I think is really cool. That's quite a few interactions.
Yeah, there's a pretty good N size for aggregating a decent amount of data.
Yes,
if you will. Let's talk a little bit about what he did with this after we let some less than compassionate advertisers try and sell you some things. Okay, we're back. We've been talking about this sort of history of David Breaux and him finding his way to a TED Talk that inspired him to do work on compassion, which at least initially meant that he was aggregating people's responses about what they thought compassion was.
Mm-hmm. So he eventually distilled all of those writings down, all of those responses, into a self-published book in 2010 called Compassion, Davis, California, a compilation of concepts on compassion. And although it's reportedly an ebook, we could only find evidence of it existing as a paperback copy, currently out of print. So you can't really get it, but it is something that there is a tangible copy of this somewhere.
And I did see multiple titles of this, even where I saw that there was like a page that you could buy it that had it as out of print and out of stock. Like one source cited it just as being called Compassion. One source cited it as being called Compassion Davis CA. Another source had it called Compassion, a compilation of concepts on compassion. Like there was various titles. So I apologize if we didn't nail down exactly the one that it was supposed to have. I was a little unclear from where I was finding different information.
Right.
And so I just figured I threw all the information in one title for us to talk about. But anyway, so he published that book. He decided to do what he called, quote, living selflessly, end quote, giving away most of his possessions. He gave away his car, his clothes. He even gave away his place to live, which he recounted all in a 2010 short film called Standing Compassion. And he set up shop sleeping on a bench in Davis's Central Park. So different, not New York Central Park, but in Davis, California.
Right. So in 2011, the local newspaper in Davis called the Davis Enterprise featured a story about Breaux and his compassion project, which is, I think pretty cool when you get like a feature story about the kind of work you're doing.
Yeah, because at this point, he's still basically standing on the street corner asking people and talking to people about compassion.
Uh-huh.
So he's starting to get a lot of attention for this, partially because even though he is he's this very tall person, kind of looming over a lot of people that come by, not everybody, of course, but a lot of people, and asking them about compassion. So people start to think of him as just this really, really nice, kind, sweet person. I'm sure people thought that he was a little quirky and weird because he was talking to strangers, but yeah, he became sort of this more and more well-recognized friendly face in the community.
Right.
Now, in 2013, David worked with the Davis community to put in a bench at this 3rd and C corner where he would hang out. And this is an earth bench public art sculpture with bright ceramic tiles and the words "Compassion is" tiled into the back, along with some other words that presumably others had said about compassion, such as on one part of the bench, they had tiled in the words listening, and another part they had tiled in giving. And if you can kind of imagine it, it doesn't really, it looks more like they carved a bench out of stone than they made like a really intentional bench. And again, I think it's meant to look that way. I don't think they did carve it out of stone. That would be intense.
Right.
But it looks like sort of a big sort of pinkish red stone with these really pretty mosaic things sort of tiled in sections of it that have some text and images and that sort of thing.
Right. It's pretty neat looking. Really, I think probably a really great centerpiece for where it's at. You know, like it's a landmark, obviously.
Right.
Now, in 2014, he was able to go on a national tour of 12 cities around the U.S., dubbed the Compassion Tour, funded by the Davis community, in which he spoke and learned about compassion. So the community themselves helped pay for him to go on this tour, which is really cool.
He picked communities, I believe, he was already interested in like compassion work that they were doing. And so he wanted to sort of go in support of those efforts, I think was what I remember reading. So, okay. Now, interesting, starting to get into, I think, close to more modernish times. He extended this idea of his and how he's talking about compassion, even against his own self-interest. He wrote on Facebook in a post in 2016, quote, "If I'm ever harmed and unable to speak for myself, forgive the perpetrator and help others forgive that person," end quote. And I think we're going to need to come back to those words because they are exactly what he says will probably be important.
You might be thinking that's a pretty extreme statement, and I think it's probably worth taking a second to pause and think about what that means for you, right? The idea that like if you yourself you are ever harmed in a way that you can't speak for yourself, then you are not saying press charges against this person, harm this person. You're saying please forgive this person and help the community around them forgive this person. That is a big pill to swallow for a lot of people.
Yeah,
and almost very difficult to like wrap your head around that yourself. So it's worth kind of taking a second to kind of maybe process what that means for you.
I agree.
Now, in 2019, his sister came to visit him and learned that he was unhoused by choice. David had been offered to stay with friends. He had been offered gainful employment. He turned it all down to live selflessly. His sister tried to help him and found a job for him, but he declined. She reported that, quote, "He reassured me that he was fine and that he was living in a state of pure love and compassion and 100% here and now in a mindfulness sense," end quote. Which is, what can you even say to that? How can you argue that?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely would understand her concern. You know, if I saw my sibling out being unhoused, I would really be trying to push for them to be in some kind of shelter, ideally a home of some sort. So I do understand that her concern, and to an extent, I understand his position. It's a complex situation.
It's a complex situation, and as somebody who may be on the outside looking in and hearing some of the family history, I would also be fearful of: are you unhoused because you're actually mindful, or are you unhoused because you're dealing with mental illness that clearly our mother had that you could possibly have as well? So I'm concerned that this is not something that you're doing of your own free will. You're doing this because you're not really making a decision in the best state of mind. So I could understand maybe from that perspective too, not understanding enough about that, or maybe assuming that might be a contributing factor.
Yeah. Good point. All right. Now, reportedly in 2023, David was planning to move into a shelter for unhoused people. So he's going to find a place where he could be. That was the last update we had about what he was going to do. So
this brings us to this year, April 27th, 2023. Heads up, this is going to take a turn from this like kind of inspirational story a little bit. In the early morning of April 27th, 2023, at age 50, David was stabbed to death while sitting on his park bench. David was the second of what would become 3 victims in a series of stabbings that had taken place around Davis, injuring an unhoused woman and resulting in the death of then 20-year-old beloved and brilliant student Abu Najim.
Yes. So someone saw David sitting slumped on his bench, seemingly unresponsive. So they called a welfare check with police, who came to see if David was okay.
And when police arrived, he was declared dead at the scene, having received a significant number of stab wounds, according to the police. That's a direct quote from the police. Significant number of stab wounds.
Yes. Now, at the time, what we've been able to find so far is only one suspect, Carlos Reales Dominguez, a 20-year-old student recently expelled from UC Davis for quote unquote academic reasons. He was arrested in connection with the stabbings, although he has since pled not guilty. And so far, there's been no motive obtained for these crimes. But worth noting that all of these happened outside. All of these happened with people who looked like they belonged to some potential ethnic minority group. 2 of the 3 were people who were very noticeably unhoused. So unsure if there was any connection there. They maybe just seemed like easy targets for the person, but at least at the time of this recording, there's been no clear motive that's been identified.
And we'll probably keep track of this just to see if there are any updates on this, because I think it's important to know what's going on here. Now, David's sister Maria, obviously crushed by the death of her brother, knew how he would want her to behave in the wake of his death. He had left it for her in writing 7 years earlier. Quote, "If I am ever harmed and unable to speak for myself, forgive the perpetrator and help others forgive that person." End quote. So coming back to that quote, I mean, this person, David, has lost his life, and he is even still asking for forgiveness for that person who did it.
Yeah, I mean, oddly prescient of him to have written that, like almost like he knew at some point that was something that could happen to him. And obviously it could happen to any of us, particularly in the United States, where gun violence is one of our national pastimes.
Yeah.
Anyway, it seems an oddly specific forecast for him to make. Now, in a phone interview with the LA Times, Maria said, quote, "I have to start the process of forgiveness. That was just something that came into my mind. I thought also this person must have been in such pain to have gotten to this point to do this. Either they're in great pain or having some kind of mental break, or someone has failed them, or maybe we failed them." End quote. And again, I just think that point of view about this is just it's so much more than I would expect even from myself, you know?
Yeah. I think there's a level of strength in that people don't talk about, like knowing like a lot of Americans, not the majority, but a lot of Americans would say that person needs to be brought to justice. They might have a lot of different, like very emotional, like maybe not revenge, but like justice oriented perspectives on this. I think it takes a lot of strength to let that go and to say, no, forgive that person because obviously there's something wrong and they need help. So maybe forgive them and get them the help they need. Sending them to prison is not going to be the help that they need. You know, I feel like there is a level of strength in that people don't talk about.
Absolutely. And it's not to say that people who do have that sense of wanting justice and feeling emotional after being traumatized or victimized, or someone being traumatized or victimized, I think it's very understandable that someone would feel that way. So it's not just to criticize that position, but man, I think just having being able to think of this in terms of like what led to this person making this horrible decision that has hurt my brother. How did they get to that point? Like what failed them along the way? Is incredible perspective taking to try and think like that. And not that we all need to, not that this person even deserved it. We're not, making a case either way, but I find it very inspiration to bring that level of thoughtfulness to your way of managing things like grief in the wake of a traumatic event like this. That's just, as you said, it does take a lot of strength.
Yeah, I mean, she even acknowledged that whoever was guilty should be kept off the streets lest they harm others, but that they should not be treated with anger or retribution. And I think I'm so glad that she went further to say, like, yes, this person needs to be, taken off the streets to keep other people safe. Like, no other people should be harmed, but from a place of love and compassion and healing versus anger, retribution, and punishment.
Yeah. Now, some online people posted disagreements, stating that they did not interpret David's meaning to include something as extreme as his own murder. Maybe they're right. I do think that his words were fairly ambiguous, and again, just to make sure we're clear, what he said was, quote, "If I'm ever harmed and unable to speak for myself, forgive the perpetrator and help others forgive that person." That seems relatively unambiguous to me. Like, right. He has already built in there, I'm unable to speak for myself. I mean, the only other circumstance is that he's like in a coma or something,
right?
Which also seems fairly extreme. So like, I think his meaning was fairly clear. People are entitled to their opinions, but that was something that sort of came up as people, I think, very upset about this, and understandably, very upset about this, saying they were more of that justice mindset. We want this person brought to justice for harming this wonderful person that we all love.
Right, this pillar of our community, really. I mean, if the community is paying for him to do a tour, and like to do these speaking engagements and really, and they're going so far as to build, a monument for this guy and all that. I mean, obviously he was meaningful for the community.
So, yeah, I mean, just this is a tragic end for someone who devoted their life to kindness, to loving others, and including complete strangers.
Yeah.
It's almost ironic in a way. It's terrible to think about. Someone whose his whole mission in life, it seemed like, was just to treat others with compassion and have others think about compassion and what that would mean in treating others still with compassion and bringing this to strangers and whatnot. And I find that just a moving place to sort of find oneself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's probably worth, in this larger discussion, unpacking this idea of compassion for a minute. I think that we do have to do that a little bit. I think I would like to give everybody maybe a little bit of space after hearing the story of Breaux. So we are going to play some ads in a second. But when we come back, we are going to unpack this idea of compassion and what it means and really kind of like just have a discussion around that.
Yes. Go Gadget ads. So that was an old reference. As we were saying, let's start to try and talk about compassion. Now, I was unable to get a copy of the book that he wrote, Compassion, Davis, California, etc. But the way that this was talked about in the TED Talk, that it was so inspirational to him, I thought was a way that we could orient to this. So the way that Karen Armstrong was talking about compassion, she really linked it to this idea of the golden rule and how that showed up particularly in religious writings like the Bible, where it was, do not do unto others what you would not have done to yourself. Or, phrased differently sometimes, do unto others what you would have done unto yourself.
Right.
And so treat others the way that you would want to be treated. That sort of idea. And I think there's actually something useful in phrasing it as a negative, the don't do unto others part of it. But nevertheless, that's part of the idea of compassion. So I think that I can get on board with what they're sort of saying there.
I think for me, when I think about compassion and what it means, and I feel like we could probably spend some time talking about empathy versus compassion versus sympathy, right? All of those things. And like, that's usually those three are kind of lumped into the same discussion. We won't do that today. I don't think it's really worth kind of diving into all of that. But I do think this idea of compassion is just being able to take some time to think about the struggles and the challenges and the things, the battles that people are going through, and approach that person still with love and with forgiveness and kindness. I mean, I think that there is something really powerful and arguably very humane in that. I think about this a lot, actually, because I work with learners who have developmental disabilities, but have been part of the state as sex offenders for different reasons, right? They've been arrested, they have victimized people. And the question I get a lot when people learn that is, how do you work with people who have done something so terrible? How do you work? I mean, and that's been something that I've had to answer often. And the question always comes up is, well, if somebody doesn't help them, who's going to?
Yeah.
Like, this person is a human being who deserves help. Like, whatever's going on, whatever they're struggling with, they still deserve a chance to get better. And I think that once I started realizing that turned into why I am so strongly against the death penalty, and why I am so strongly against these like lengthy punishments that don't teach anybody anything. Like, it doesn't really, I think that's where that's come from for me. Even though I felt like I was always kind of compassionate, I've learned that in that space, that finding humanity and the people that you interact with is so much more important than the things they've done sometimes.
Yeah. And I mean, just as you were sort of alluding to, and I feel like we brought this up a little bit in a previous discussion, but I'd like to think about this in terms of understanding crime and other things that people do where we see that as being some kind of punishable offense. We talked about like people driving poorly and that sort of thing, and is understanding why that person is behaving that way in the first place. Once you start to unpack that thought about like, what are the circumstances that led you down this path? This sort of comes back to fundamental attribution error, which we've talked about before.
Right.
Is this because you're a bad person? Or is there some circumstance that we could point to where pretty much anybody in that same situation would have eventually ended up where you are now?
Right.
It's almost always the latter. Like, you could almost always push someone to the brink of doing extreme things that they said or thought they would never do, given the right circumstances. And some people are just driven straight there from birth. They're just on this trajectory toward this almost inescapable fate, it feels like. because they just keep getting beaten down. They keep getting, the things that when they do the right thing, it gets punished. When they do the wrong thing, it gets rewarded. And eventually they figure out, like, the thing that makes the most sense for me is this path here that maybe involves criminal activity and that sort of thing. When violence gets normalized, when violence gets treated as something that is glorified, and it's actually part of my concern with the death penalty is, like, I remember hearing this saying, which I thought was, like, quippy and inauthentic with it the first time I heard it, which was like, why do we kill people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong?
Right.
But it actually kind of, like, it does make sense. And I mean, if you really think about it, like, yeah, we're saying essentially that sometimes it's okay to murder people. And eventually I found myself in the position of saying, I think we've just got to stop saying that's okay.
Right.
And I do get the emotional need for justice that people experience when they've been harmed. But I think if we want to practically set up a situation where we stop teaching people that violence is okay, because if it's okay sometimes, then who authors the conditions?
Right.
Who gets to write what sometimes means? And arguably, it's whoever, and whatever the situation seems to call for. In the United States, we're in a situation where we have people who simply walk into the wrong house who are now being murdered at, like, a regular rate. That's just a thing that happens now. They accidentally walked into the wrong house. They accidentally pulled into the wrong driveway. They accidentally stepped foot onto the wrong property and they were shot to death as an outcome of that. That does not feel like justice. That does not feel like it's appropriate. And it's this fear of people, this fear of others. It is this sense of righteous, vindictive hate and fear and violence that has been so normalized. It's all the opposite of the things that I think David would have pushed for.
Yeah.
It's worth thinking about, like, who do we want to be and who do we want to what do we want this to look like for the next generation?
Well, and I think part of it too is understanding in kind of unpacking all that, what it is that you need in that space. I think as a general rule, compassion is a better way to lead a society than justice, punishment, harm, all that stuff. I think as a general rule, it's good. However, we can also recognize that, like, relationships are complicated.
Yeah.
Like, I think that in some situations, like, with David's situation with his dad, like, that sounds like an incredibly complex situation where my only relationship is this violence, and now I've got to go be this person's caretaker. Like, not everybody has I guess I don't want to say motivation, because that's not really what it is. I think it's challenging.
Fortitude, maybe?
Maybe fortitude. I mean, it could be any number of things, right? But I think it's very challenging to unpack that and to expose yourself to that when trauma is involved, when harm is involved.
Yeah.
I think it's a more difficult road. Maybe that's what I'm looking for. It's a more difficult road to forgiveness for some people if you ever get there. And
totally.
and compassion is just one of those things where if you lead with compassion, maybe that's an easier way to get there. Maybe it's more healing. Maybe it unburdens you or some. But again, relationships are complex, and that's not a prescription for everybody, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important thing too to kind of recognize that is, like, if I'm willing to approach a situation from a compassionate lens, then I also am willing to recognize that not everybody has the ability to do that or has a long road to do that. And so every human has their own quips and quibbles and rocky roads and all the things that they've got to deal with on their own road and their own path of forgiveness. And so I think it's really important to take a step and look at that too.
That is one of my favorite things that I think you've ever said on this podcast. That was beautiful.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
I completely agree. You're absolutely right, is that we have to look at everybody. And that means that people we fundamentally disagree with on things.
Yeah.
And, we regularly rag on politicians and public figures that we think do terrible things and make bad decisions.
Low-hanging fruit.
Low-hanging fruit. We're punching up. These are people who have a lot more power, a lot more status, a lot more money than we do. And we're looking at them. And I think a lot of times I'm thinking you could be a beacon for good in this world, and you choose to be a beacon for fear. Right. You choose to be an inciting figure to, like, cause harm. And it's frustrating. And I think that if we want to practice what we preach, we have to look at them with compassion too. And I honestly think that a part of this idea of compassion is it almost doesn't matter. It's almost not compassion if you can't do it, or if you can't do it when it's hard.
Right.
Right. Like, compassion isn't just like, this is easy. Compassion is, this is hard.
Right.
This is a time when I don't want to forgive somebody. And those are the instances where you really are seeing that person for who they are. And this goes back to the point that, we were just talking about what compassion is seeing someone for who they are in the situation that they're in and understanding where they're coming from so that you can choose to, if you wish, be a space for that person to do better.
Right.
Even when you don't want to, even when you're frustrated. We're all sort of learning and going through this. So,
right. I think the thing that I take away from all of that is that compassion is not an obligation to forgive.
Yeah, that's fair. I like that.
I think it's an attempt to understand, but I don't think it's an obligation to forgive. And I think that's really important for people who you can still be a compassionate person and still struggle with forgiveness. And I think that's where I land on all of it more than anything.
I think that's great. It's a really good point. Well, we managed to riff on that pretty sufficiently. I'm actually very pleased. There is one more piece of this, which I think is relevant to what we were just describing, understanding sort of why would someone be able to embrace compassion? Thinking of this again from the sort of psychological perspective, what gets in the way for people? What doesn't? How does that work? Why did David do this?
Right.
Probably another one to think about. So, We've probably made it far enough to let the advertisers do their thing. I think we can justify that, and then you can try and feel compassion for them. Good luck, I guess. We'll be right back. All right, hopefully those ads were as good for you as could be expected. Sometimes, you get lucky and no ads play during our ad breaks because we just create the space for them and say you can play ads here, and then the algorithm decides whether to put them in, and they're targeted. So if you got an advertisement for anger management, then that's on you, buddy. Just kidding.
Check your algorithm, baby.
Just kidding. Anyway, why do this? Why do this compassion thing?
So it is worth unpacking kind of the functions or outcomes of behavior within this, right? Everything is somewhat transactional in a sense. We kind of unpacked that a little bit in our altruism episode where, nothing is really altruistic because you are still gaining something out of it. But that is to say, what do we get out of every interaction that we have? It's worth evaluating that and looking at that. In some instances, it may be as simple as we do X, we receive X, right? Or receive Y, like putting money in a vending machine and getting a snack in return. It might be more complicated. It might be more cerebral. It might be more esoteric. And that's what makes this one a little bit more complicated, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it can be more arbitrary and more abstracted, such as something we might get out of an interaction is the correspondence between what we hold important and our actions.
Mm-hmm.
That could be its own reward. I've done a thing that I think is important to me, or I think is in line with my values or what's important to me. Or another example is a feeling of social reciprocity when you make someone happy.
Yeah.
Like, nobody handed you a candy bar for doing something nice to somebody, but you felt good.
Right.
Because we're such a social species. Social reciprocity is a fairly built-in reinforcer for us. We see helping others. We do things for our community, and we feel better as an outcome of doing that, particularly when we know that we've made someone's day a little bit better. And sometimes, like, those things by themselves function. Those are the functions, if you will. Those are the outcomes. It's transactional in that sense, but again, it's not always transactional in a financial or tangible sense. Often, the outcome that we get is a feeling of, like, this felt right, this felt good, this felt like. There's a whole thing in here, I think, that we're talking about is like, this thing happened the way I expected it to happen. And that by itself is a outcome that I was looking for.
Yeah.
Is I just wanted this to go in this direction, and it did.
If you're unpacking different concepts from behavioral lens, there is, if folks that are listening are familiar with signs of damage is essentially like an organism is in pain or discomfort and they engage in like some type of behavior, and the resulting outcome is maybe feeling better, but mostly seeing the damage of the behavior, right? Seeing blood, seeing crying, seeing broken items. Like there's some little bit of research in that space, but the opposite of that would be true too, right? Signs of repair. Why do people restore old furniture or restore cars or like repair homes or fix things? Like you're not necessarily, I mean, if it's your thing, maybe you're getting some utility out of whatever that is. Maybe you're avoiding something that's like aversive or uncomfortable. But for the most part, when people do restoration projects, they're restoring things because it feels good to bring things back to life and to repair things and like see something move towards a better state than it was before. And I think that in itself is really worth unpacking as well. I think to me, that's what this really screams is, you know, I'm doing this thing as a signs of repair for my community, for relationships, for people that thrive in this space that I'm currently thriving in.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. Another really great one in this episode that I don't think I'd heard that before. And I love that because you're right. Signs of damage is one we hear about, but signs of repair make a lot of sense. And it really does align with this. If you think about, if I see someone who is struggling with something, who maybe has done something that a lot of people would find abhorrent, and I go in and say, like, I'm going to have a real heart to heart with this person. I want to just find out where they're coming from, what they're feeling, and see if I can help them find a better path for themselves. That would look like compassion. And I think the transactional part of that is this could be this person, there's signs that they then are making progress toward making different decisions.
Right.
That they're now behaving more compassionately and more thoughtfully toward others. And yeah, I like that a lot. That I think thinking about compassion as having signs of repair, I think is really cool.
Yeah.
As sort of one of the outcomes for what do you get out of this work. I don't know. You could go all day. There are lots of ways that I think you could describe what the potential outcomes could be, because we don't know, and it could be different for everybody, and it could change day to day. On one day, David may have done this out of a sense of obligation, feeling like my day won't feel complete unless I do this work.
Right.
On another day, it may have been, I want to see the look on someone's face when they have an epiphany.
Right.
That could be the outcome. And maybe it never thought as clearly as I want, was maybe never even in his language, but just sort of this is the thing that's going to get me through today. This is the thing that feels like it makes it all worth it. And that could change moment to moment, person to person.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, those are the ways we think of what are the drivers of behavior? What are the outcomes that motivate us to choose to do things? And thinking of it in that way of what do you get out of this transactionally, which again, in most of the time is not tangible. I think the vast majority of the time, these are arbitrary, intangible outcomes that are thoughts, their feelings, their correspondence, there's expectations. That those things, they can be the drivers of the decisions that we make that look like this, that seem like they don't have any clear outcome, but there is one.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I couldn't have said it better myself.
Awesome. Any more to say on this or about David Breaux before we wrap up today?
I mean, obviously, there's not a lot to know about this guy, especially because it's a fairly new story. As more information comes up, we are going to be able to share updates and stuff as we go. But yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a really humane way to live in terms of putting people's humanity above a lot of other, I think that's a nice way to look at the world. I think it yields less anger towards people and the things they do.
Yeah. And I think, as far as other take home points, I just thinking about and really thinking about why we even chose to talk about this in the first place is just this guy's, he spent his life championing this idea of compassion and then was stabbed to death and had left this message about not being vengeful or vindictive toward whatever perpetrator may have committed whatever crime against him. And just thinking what a cool platform or an opportunity to use this platform to talk about this idea of compassion, why it drove him, the way he touched and influenced other people. And I just thought that was a cool conversation for us to get to have. It felt, this one felt a little bit more personal, a little bit more free flowing, if you will, than some of our other discussions where we have a lot of specific points we're trying to make. And I kind of like that. I feel like there was some utility there. So hopefully people got something similar out of it.
100%.
Well, let's go ahead and close it out there then. I think there's some important things we need to know, which is that if you'd like to support us, as I said at the beginning, wherever you're listening to this, leave a rating and review, join us on Patreon. If you do that, you get extra content, bonus things. People who have joined us on Patreon include Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, and Ashley. That is not one really long name. That is a whole bunch of individual names from people who support us. We really appreciate them.
Just to be clear.
Yeah, just to make sure we're clear. You could also pick up some merch in our merch store. You can subscribe to our podcast. If you would like to talk to us about compassion or about any of the recommendations we're about to give, you can email us directly, info@wwd.podcast.com, or join us on the social media platforms. And also, you get to listen to this because of the people who make this happen. Writing and fact checking from Shane and myself, audio engineering and editing from Justin, and our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson, my team. Thank you all, and they're the ones who make this happen, so appreciate you.
Yay!
And of course, thank you all for listening, and of course, thank you for recording with me today, Shane.
Of course.
But we're not done yet. We have some recommendations.
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 All right, I'm recommending a movie that came out, I believe it was this year. I tend to not like rom-coms very much, mostly because I find their plots to be paper thin and extremely cookie cutter.
Right.
Like you can pretty much predict what's going to happen scene to scene, sometimes line by line.
Right.
In a show. But there was this movie that came out that sort of it took the idea of a romantic comedy and sort of put a totally different spin on it, which was really fun to watch. And it's called Bros.
Okay.
Largely starring Billy Eichner, but also had Bowen Yang from Saturday Night Live and several other really fun actors that people recognize. The actor whose name I'm forgetting, who was on Community, was on here. Anyway, it's sort of a rom-com, if you will. Very funny, but it took a slightly different spin on it. I will go and say it's largely an LGBTQ plus type film.
Sure.
But nevertheless, I think really, really funny, really just, it's a lighthearted good time. So sit down and enjoy.
I like it. I heard it was pretty funny. I heard it was pretty good.
Yeah, I liked it.
All right. Speaking of the opposite of lighthearted, I just finished a book called The Fisherman by John Langan. This was recommended to me by a friend of mine who the type of horror genre that we like is not just slasher. I mean, not that we don't appreciate that stuff. Like I always like slasher and murder mystery stuff, but
sure.
This one's a little bit different. It's more of a cosmic horror.
Oh.
And this one's really cool because it takes place in the Appalachian Mountains.
Okay.
So it's got a little bit of that kind of like old world, old gods feel.
I'm getting some H.P. Lovecraft vibes.
Very, very Lovecraft. Yes, very Lovecraft. I mean, there is a giant, a beast Leviathan that is part of it's on the other side of the veil of reality as part of this story. Like it really takes a wild turn. And that's not going to spoil anything because the details in the story are very cool. Like it's family members who have passed, who are brought back to life through dark magic. It's people who live longer than they're supposed to. It's like, doorways to other worlds beyond these. And it really starts off with this character named Abraham, who is a fisherman and starts kind of discovering local lore and unpacking that local lore over time. Like a big chunk of the story is a story that somebody else tells about this, like the history of this particular creek. It's not at all what I expected, and I am obsessed with this guy's writing now. So I am really ready to dive into this stuff.
Okay. I'm going to have to add that to my list. You really sold this. Fun recommendation.
It's so good.
Awesome. Well, I think that's pretty much all I have. If you'd like to talk to us about those recommendations, reach out to us. Of course, talk to us about Compassion. Look up more about David Breaux. But otherwise, anything else that we need to add or anything that you would like to add or that I missed before we wrap up, Shane?
Nope, I think that covers it.
Perfect. Then I think that's all we've got. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.